Just wanted to start off, if I may, by asking a question about supply-demand of gas in the USA. The latest IEA estimates show a significant reduction in planned US LNG import estimates. And I was just wondering whether you could comment on the supply-demand balance today and in the future.
Sure. I think from the near-term supply-demand balance, we've seen the reaction of domestic supplies, particularly in the form of non-conventional supplies, forestalling the need for large LNG exports and therefore holding prices down, combined with more attractive prices elsewhere in the Pacific and Atlantic basins pulling LNG away. And so I think EIA is simply reflecting the reality of the market right now, which is we're not thirsting for it as bad as other markets. Long-term, EIA, I think, is fairly conservative in their demand views because they're not fully reflecting the potential that greenhouse gas emission legislation or regional gas initiatives will have to stimulate near-term and longer-term demand for gas. And so we have to, maybe the jury's still out on long-term supply-demand balance.
Actually, you mentioned something interesting I was going to raise, which is about non-conventional gas. And I just wanted to ask you about the role of non-conventional gas in gas supply in the US, because presumably that's going to be increasing, isn't it?
It is going to be increasing, at least projections are. There's a lot left to understand about it. It's a relatively new supply, at least in the scale that it's come on in recent years. In recent years, I mean the last 4 years.
Right.
And
it has come on quickly, hasn't it?
It has. It has. But
and that's in response to the market, is it? The market
clearly,
yeah.
Clearly, in response to price. I mean, there may be uncertainty as to whether or not $5, $6, or $7 is the sustainable price to incent the new drilling that's needed to keep the supply resource growing. But in terms of its ability to respond and for producers, particularly America's independents, to go get the gas, they've responded very quickly.
Now, they're interesting numbers. You're talking about $5, $6, $7, maybe even $8 potentially for some of them. You know, is the US consumer going to be willing to pay those numbers? Surely we're going to start seeing some demand destruction in some of the heavy industrial users, aren't we?
You have already seen fairly large exodus of heavy industry from the U.S., at least where energy use is concerned. So I think you have to break it down, David, by sector. And if you look at it from a power generation standpoint, you ask the question, what are the substitutes? And right now, absent coal, near-term substitutes aren't to be found, so we expect gas use to rise in power generation. From an industrial sector standpoint, I think a lot of people felt like we would reach bedrock at about 18 BCF a day, and it seems like we have leveled off in that. I don't know if that's a technical limit beyond which we really will be much more elastic in terms of gas prices. But for now, even at $7 and $8 prices, industrial demand seems to be holding. NEIA's forecast is growing. It is.
Oh, it is. That's the same the world over, isn't it? We're seeing people stepping up to these higher numbers.
Somebody has to produce something. So, and I would say that the composition of industrial gas use, you have to take a North American view, and a lot of the forecasted numbers may include industrial gas use in the oil sands as a substitute for manufacturing industry. And so we'll watch that closely. On the residential side, it's interesting. The AGA recently released a report, which I have not read in its entirety. American Gas Association. They are traditionally the we'll call it the lobbying arm of the natural gas utilities in America, and they have noted the potential for increasing elasticities in consumer response.
Well, you mentioned about price risk and obviously price volatility, and therefore, you know, with high prices being commanded for gas and LNG, which is, as you've said, pulling out of the Atlantic Basin into Asia, are we honestly going to see any LNG coming into the States, or are we going to see it going into other markets which are willing to offer higher prices?
Well, two-part answer to that. First, I think we have to understand why gas is being pulled out. And it seems to me that these are short-term dislocations of power generation, be it in Spain because of droughts or in Japan because of nuclear outages, causing spot prices to spike, where we have seen historically longer-term contract prices tied to oil have been a little more stable and comparable to U.S. prices. So if we keep having disruptions or we have gas demand growth for power generation in Asia and Europe, as we're expected to do, then it's going to be tougher to get gas to the States. On the other hand, when you're looking at gas coming into the States, our prices have to rise, which means more elasticity on the gas consumption side is probably not likely, where I think Americans are typically a little reluctant to dial back the thermostat is on power. And if we do have gas generation and gas-fired generation, and we have to go into the global market to bid for those supplies, I think that's exactly what will happen. And you'll see a convergence globally, more so than we're seeing today.
The next couple of questions I want to ask about looking forward, if I may. Sure. And the first one is, we're all following very closely the US primaries at the moment, and of course that's going to lead into an election, which may mean there's a change in the White House next year.
Well, definitely will be a change of one sort or another.
Absolutely, there will be a change. But the question is, will there be a change in energy policy? Do you think that if the Democrats were to get in, there will be a distinct change, or do you think it'll be more of the same?
Well, I don't think it'll be more of the same, at least in the sense that either party seems to be more liberal at this point in their next election than the current administration. And it's hard to gauge a change when we really haven't had a coherent policy to speak of. I think our policy has been let the market decide, and it's largely treated us well. Whether or not we have market changes from the past 10 years or so, I think will depend on how aware people are of what the ramifications of their decisions are. And we all want to be green, as we're all citizens of the planet, but there's a price tag with that, and we have to first understand what that price tag is, and then people will make rational decisions.
I'm sure they will. Which brings me to my second forward-thinking picture. I mean, just ask you, for your views on, 10 years from today, what's your vision kind of for the gas and LNG business in the States?
I think clearly we're going to need all forms of energy, not just in the U.S., but globally. We heard this morning in the conference that the European outlook is not a whole lot different than the States in terms of supply gap. We certainly know that rising demand in the Asian countries is causing a thirst for natural gas. And so we're going to need LNG, and we'll need LNG in the States just the same as on the other two continents. At the same time, we're going to need other forms of energy too, and whereas we might have once looked at coal, nuclear, renewables as a substitute for gas, I think clearly we're finding that gas is compatible with renewables, particularly wind, and other intermittent sources of power, so we have to have both there. And I don't know how, given the projections that we heard earlier in the meeting, that we can meet all the demand without also bringing nuclear and coal in one form back into the market, more so than they have been.
You mentioned the N-word.
The N-word.